The lantern appears first, a single point of amber moving across the darkened moor, small and steady, neither hurrying nor faltering in the wind that comes off the high ground above Westridge. From a distance, from, say, the library window of the great house, it might be taken for a farmer's light, or a poacher's, or the particular kind of purposeful glow belonging to someone who has done this walk many times and knows precisely where the soft ground is. Closer, it resolves into a young woman in a grey wool shawl, her head bent, her free hand wrapped against her ribs for warmth. Below her, the black windows of Westridge Hall press their cold faces to the night. And in the black kitchen, a young woman's hand closes over a heel of bread she did not earn. Her name is Margaret Felbridge. Remember it. Westridge had known better winters. In the years when the old Duke still rode his acres before first light, when the fires in the east wing burned through the night, and the footman stood straight in livery that had not yet begun to fray at the cuffs, the house had carried the quality of a place that intended to endure. Stone, silver, and a deep domestic industry. It had seemed permanent as the moor itself, as the dark fell of heather that ran unbroken to the horizon on three sides. The kitchen smelled of rendered fat and beeswax. The carpet runners were beaten before winter set in. The windows in the long gallery were reglazed every third autumn before the cold could find the old putty. That was the house as it had been, and the house as it had been lived in the memory of every servant, who remained from those years in the set of Mrs. Grimes's jaw when she walked the passages, in the way old Henderson still mucked his own stable before he let any groom boy near it. That was before the grief. That was before the younger Duke retreated. His name, the full weight of it, the title and the obligation, was Alistair Dunwood. And he had inherited it at 29, when his father died of a fever that moved fast and chose its man on a Wednesday evening. He had been prepared for the inheritance in the way that second sons are prepared, thoroughly in theory, inadequately in fact. His older brother Harry had been the one raised to manage the estate, to understand the difference between what the solicitor says and what the ledger means, to sit with the tenants in wet autumn and hear what they were not saying. Harry, who had ridden off to Portugal with a commission bought at considerable expense and a laughing assurance that it would all be an adventure, had not come back. The letter that arrived from the peninsula, military language performing grief it could not genuinely feel, had reached Alistair on the same morning his father's physician asked him to come down urgently. He had lost them both within a fortnight, and the shock of it had done something to the mechanism behind his eyes that had not yet been repaired. He had not closed the house. He had done something more corrosive. He had simply stopped watching it. And an estate, like anything that requires attention to remain sound, will exploit an absence the moment it senses one. The steward's name was Creel, a spare, fair-haired man of 40 who wore respectability the way some men wear borrowed hats, plausibly enough, but without the ease of genuine ownership. Within a fortnight of the new Duke's withdrawal, Creel had begun keeping a second ledger, leather-backed, stored not in the estate office, but in the bottom drawer of his own writing desk. This private record told a different story than the quarterly summaries he submitted to the solicitor in Leeds. The coal merchant was paid in full. The figures Creel presented said twice that. The undergardeners received their wages. The ledger noted a surcharge for what Creel had labelled, with a certain bureaucratic confidence, supervisory expenditure. The difference, not large in any single entry, significant across 2 years of entries, travelled south by post-chaise to a card-room in York, where Creel lost it with the methodical optimism of a man who believes the next hand will be the one that finally resolves his situation. It never was. He had begun, by December, to look at the estate's silver, and calculate not its value to the house, but its liquidity. None of this was Margaret's problem. Not yet. She had arrived at Westridge in the second week of December, stepping down from the Harrogate carrier's cart with a single canvas bag and a character reference so precisely worded that Mrs. Grimes read it twice before she could satisfy herself it was genuine. Mrs. Grimes was a compact woman of 55, widow of a saddler in the next market town, with eyes the colour of creek water and the rare and useful talent of appearing to study the wall opposite while actually studying whoever stood before her. She hired Margaret as under-housemaid at £8 per annum, noted the girl's voice with the flicker of attention she gave to things that required explaining later, and said nothing further than was necessary. What Mrs. Grimes did not say, and what Margaret did not confess, was the single fact that altered the meaning of everything else. Margaret Felbridge had not come to Westridge for the £8. She had come for the keeper's cottage at the far edge of the North Park, a stone building that had stood empty for 3 years since old Hartley the gamekeeper died without an heir to his position, and the Duke's attention had been elsewhere. The cottage had a sound roof, a workable hearth, and, this was what had mattered when Margaret had scouted it in October, on the pretext of inquiring after seasonal work in the neighbouring village, a location half a mile beyond the last outbuilding, invisible from the road, approachable only by a footpath through stands of dark larch that kept their counsel even when the leaves were gone. She had measured the hearth with a length of cord. She had tested the window catches. She had noted the direction the chimney smoke would carry in a north wind. She was that kind of person, thorough, always a step ahead of the trouble that was coming, always counting the exits before she entered a room. Her brother Tom had been reported dead at Badajoz. The army's letter, arriving at their mother's house in September of 1812, had been careful and impersonal in the way of official things, the language of administration performing a sorrow it was not constituted to feel. Their mother had believed it. Margaret had not. She had written to 3 of Tom's fellow soldiers, letters that cost her a week's earnings in postage, and received in reply a single crumpled sheet from a corporal named Davis, who confirmed what she had suspected. Tom Felbridge was alive. He had not died, but had broken, body and nerve, in ways the corporal's letter could only gesture at obliquely, as men do when they are trying to describe something they would rather not look at directly. He had been discharged without ceremony, and without the back pay he was owed, and he had walked home from the coast because he had no money for the coach. It had taken him 40 days. By the time he had crossed back into the county, the creditors had already begun their inquiries. A moneylender in Sheffield, who held notes from before Tom's enlistment, and a sutler who claimed debts from the regiment that Tom disputed and could not disprove while bedridden. Tom needed somewhere no one would look. Margaret had found it for him. The rhythms of Westridge in midwinter were those of any house where economy has begun to outpace pride, without quite finishing the job. Rooms went unheated. Furniture that had once been polished twice weekly was touched now perhaps once a month, and only the pieces in rooms where the Duke or Mrs. Grimes might actually appear. The dining table in the great room was set for one man at one end, a single place among 30 empty chairs, the silver candlesticks tarnished at their bases where the polishing cloth had stopped bothering to reach. Margaret rose at 5, lit the kitchen range, swept the back passages, cleaned the grates in the rooms still in use, and carried water. She was not unhappy in the work. She had been raised in a house with a library, by a father who believed that education was the one inheritance impervious to debt, who had read aloud at the dinner table from Gibbon and from the Augustan poets until the bailiffs arrived and the table itself was carried out. He had been partly right. Margaret could name the Roman generals on the spines of Westridge's library shelves by their campaign records. She carried their inheritors' water jugs with the same quiet attention she gave to everything. What she could not accomplish honestly, she managed otherwise. The larder at Westridge was not closely supervised. Mrs. Grimes kept a mental inventory rather than a written one, and in a house where the master rarely appeared and the steward was more interested in his private arithmetic than in the household's daily consumption, a careful hand could extract what was needed without provoking inquiry. A heel of bread. A wedge of hard cheese, not the good one. A cold potato held back from the servant's supper. Margaret wrapped each item in a square of oiled cloth, tucked it beneath her apron, and transferred it to the canvas bag she kept at the back of the dry goods cupboard. 3 times a week, when her half-day permitted, she made the walk north through the park. Mrs. Grimes noticed. Of course she did. This was a woman who could tell you, without consulting any record, how many candle stubs remained in the second footman's pantry. She stood in the larder doorway one afternoon and looked at the shelf where the hard cheese was kept, and her expression did not change, and she said nothing. She turned and walked back to the kitchen and asked Margaret whether the grates in the upper hall had been done to satisfaction. And when Margaret said they had, Mrs. Grimes nodded and moved on. She had not decided what to do. She had only decided that she was not ready to decide, and that in the meantime the girl carried herself like someone who had not properly slept in longer than a week, which told its own story, even if it did not yet tell the whole one. The warning came from Mr. Henderson. The head groom had turned 60 without appearing to have noticed it, still moving through the stables with the settled authority of a man whose conclusions were formed decades ago and had required no substantial revision since. He had a white scar along his left jaw, from a horse that had caught him once when he was young enough to be surprised by it, and he had the horseman's habit of watching everything at an angle, never quite meeting a thing head-on, as though direct approach was a courtesy reserved for animals he already trusted. He noticed Margaret on her 3rd day, which was 2 days after most people would have, and he said nothing to her for a full week, which was his way of deciding whether she was worth the trouble of a conversation. He found her at the scullery door on a Tuesday morning, the sleet coming in sideways off the moor, and the sky the particular colourless white that promises nothing will improve before dark. She was checking the latch on the outer door, which had begun to stick in the wet cold, and he stopped beside her with his hands in his coat pockets and looked out at the weather with the considering expression of a man who has long since made his peace with the fact that it will do whatever it intends, regardless of his opinion. "You've been going north," he said. Not a question. Margaret kept her hands on the latch. "I walk on my half-days." "Aye." He was quiet for a moment. "North path takes you past the old keeper's cottage." She did not answer. Henderson turned his head and looked at her directly, which she understood now was a thing he did only when something had been settled. His Grace's temper runs cold, not hot, wants you to know that. He doesn't shout, he dismisses. You'll be on the carrier back to Harrogate before you've heard your name said twice, and there'll be no character to follow you. He paused. And he hasn't slept more than 4 hours together since October. That makes a cold temper colder. Why are you telling me this? Henderson considered the question seriously, which she had not entirely expected. Because Mrs. Grimes has told me not to tell her anything further on the subject, which means she knows enough to be careful and not enough to act. And because I was a soldier's son. He looked back at the sleet. Waterloo. My father came back wrong, same as some do. Took him 2 years to come back the rest of the way. He tucked his chin once, the gesture of a man concluding a thing without sentimentality. Don't get caught. And don't go out in a storm without a proper lantern. The north path crosses the drainage ditch at the second larch stand, and the plank is rotten on the left side. He walked back to the stables before she could answer. She stood in the scullery doorway and felt the cold air on her face, and that was the whole of the conversation. And it was enough. That night, the sleet turned to something worse. By 9 o'clock, the wind had swung northwest, and brought with it a driving mixture of ice and snow that coated the ground in a treacherous grey glaze and found every gap in the windowsills of Westridge's older wing. The kitchen fire had been banked for the night. The passages were dark except for the wall sconce at the back stairhead, which threw a thin yellow ellipse across the flagstones, and no further. Margaret had waited in her attic room until the house was fully quiet, until she heard the last footfall of the night footman doing his rounds, until Mrs. Grimes's light went out on the floor below. She had waited one more quarter hour after that, the cold working through the thin blanket she sat wrapped in, watching the candle on her deal table burn down to a stub. Then she dressed, took the canvas bag, lit the lantern she kept on the floor beside the chest, a small brass-fitted horn lantern, old but sound, with a new wick she had installed in November, and went down the back stairs and out into the storm. The North Park in winter was a different country than the grounds Margaret moved through in daylight. The great beeches that made a cathedral of the drive were stripped to their architecture now, black ribs against the lighter dark of the sky, the wind moving through them with a sound like something that had once been language and had lost its meaning. The path was there if you knew where to look, a slight depression in the ground that held its line through the dead grass, and Margaret moved along it with the lantern held low, watching for the 2 larch stands that Henderson had named. The plank bridge at the drainage ditch was exactly where he had said, and she stepped to the right side without hesitating. She was nearly to the cottage when the lantern guttered. The wind got into it from the south, a gust that preceded a heavier squall by perhaps 4 seconds, and the flame bent almost flat and then steadied. But not before she saw how close to the edge of the chimney the wick had burned, and understood that she had perhaps 20 minutes of useful light remaining. She put her back to the wind and cupped both hands around the lantern and kept moving. Tom was in the cottage. She had known this before she opened the door, because the chimney was drawing, barely but perceptibly, a faint suggestion of smoke taken sideways immediately by the wind. Inside, the light from the hearth was also barely. He had stretched his last fuel across 2 days when the storm had kept her from coming, and what remained was a pair of thin logs reduced to embers and a heat that reached perhaps 3 feet from the grate. He was on the pallet she had made for him, from a folded horse blanket and a cornsack mattress she had stuffed herself, and he was shivering in the particular, rigid, controlled way of a man who has been shivering so long that his body has become mechanical about it. He was 26. He looked older. The peninsula had put years on him that no amount of ordinary living would have put there. A kind of weather in the face, a quality of stillness about the eyes that was not peace, but its opposite. The stillness of something that has stopped expecting what it used to expect. His left leg was splinted. He had come to the cottage with the break already partially healed wrong, and Margaret had done what she could with poultice and alignment, which was considerably less than what the break required. The crutch she had made for him from a forked ash branch stood against the wall, its crosspiece wrapped in cloth she had wound carefully to protect his arm. He had carved a small bird into the wood of the handle during the long days she was not there. A merlin, wings tucked, beak precise, in the same obsessive, detailed way he had always worked with his hands. The part of him that the war had not yet reached. "You shouldn't have come in this," he said. His voice was roughened with the cold. "I brought bread." She set the bag down and moved to the hearth, and took the last 3 pieces of wood from the corner and laid them with the care of someone rationing a necessity. She had also, tonight, managed a small piece of salt pork wrapped in paper and a twist of dried apples from the storeroom, and she arranged these on the stone lip of the hearth, where the heat would reach them. "Margaret." He watched her. He still did that. Watched her the way he had watched her when they were children, and she was performing competence in the face of some small domestic disaster, as though the watching itself was a form of assistance he could offer, when the other kinds, were unavailable to him. What happens when the weather holds like this for a fortnight? What happens when they do the winter inventory and count the larder? I'll manage the winter inventory. You can't manage everything. She did not answer immediately. She was feeding the fire, coaxing the thin new wood into contact with the remaining embers, and it required her full attention for a moment. When she sat back on her heels, the flame was small but committed. "You'll dance again," she said. It was not a reassurance she had calculated. It was the true thing, the thing she had decided and intended to hold to, regardless of what the leg did or did not do. When the road is clear and Dr. Ames can be brought out. Dr. Ames is in Harrogate, and I have no name he can be trusted with. I'll find someone. She looked at him steadily. You will dance again, Tom. I promise it. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind pushed against the cottage with a sound like the flat of a hand against a wall, and the repaired window, Margaret had stuffed the gap in the casement with oiled wool in October, held. The fire settled into its new material and began, tentatively, to give actual heat. Tom's shoulders eased by perhaps a half-inch, the incremental physics of a body relinquishing a small fraction of its vigilance. You burned your shawl, he said. He was looking at her shoulders, which were covered only by the wool of her dress and a thin house jacket she had put on over it. She had not meant him to notice. She had come directly from the hearth in her room, where the shawl, fine grey merino, the last good garment that connected her to the life before the bailiffs, had served as tinder for the cottage hearth 3 nights ago, when the coal was gone and she had nothing else. It had caught well. Merino always did. I have another, she said. He knew she was lying. He did not argue, which was its own form of grace. He reached out and took the bread she had put on the hearthstone, and ate it slowly, in the careful way of a man who has learned to be deliberate about hunger, and the fire climbed to something that resembled warmth, and outside the sleet moved across the moor and erased the footpath Margaret had come by. At the library window, the Duke could not sleep. Alistair Dunwood was not, by temperament, a man who looked out of windows. He was a man of interiors, of books stacked at angles on side tables, of correspondence replied to in a hand that grew smaller and more compressed as the evening went on, of fires kept too high because he felt the cold in a way that had grown sharper since the autumn. The library was the room he had effectively inhabited since November, a large, dark-panelled space that smelled of leather binding and old paper and the faint ghost of tobacco from his father's pipe, which had been laid down on that particular mantelpiece and not moved since the afternoon the physician came upstairs. He left it there deliberately. He had not examined his reasons for doing so. He stood at the window because he had run out of the particular quality of attention that reading requires. He had been attempting the 3rd volume of A History of the Lake Campaigns in Iberia, a book he had ordered from a London bookseller in September, with the intention of understanding what Harry's last years had contained, and had found tonight that the text, which was specific and clear and admirably researched, had ceased to mean anything to him. The words resolved themselves into print and then dissolved before they could accumulate into comprehension. He had put the book face down on the side table, which he never did, and gone to the window instead. The moor was invisible. The sleet made a shifting curtain beyond the glass, and the grounds immediate to the house were only barely distinguishable by the fact that the snow had begun to settle in thin patches between the sleet's darker wash. He was watching nothing in particular, the particular unfocused way of a man who has traded the failure of one kind of inward looking for the lesser failure of staring at weather, when he saw it. The light. Not a household light, not one of the stable lanterns, not the pattern a groom would carry to a late check on the horses. This was a single point moving north across the park, steady in a way that spoke of someone who knew the path and was walking it with intention. It had the quality of a light that was trying to be small, He watched it cross the open ground between the stand of beeches and the dark mass of the larch plantation, and then it passed into the larches and was gone. He stood at the window for some minutes after that. Then he picked up the history of the Iberian campaigns and carried it back to his chair and opened it, and the words made no more sense than they had before. And he sat with it open in his lap and stared at the fire he kept too high, and thought about a light that was trying to be small and was not quite managing it. The frost that followed the sleet hardened the ground to iron. 2 days later, a crack appeared in the kitchen passage ceiling where the damp had got behind the plaster, and a chunk the size of a soup tureen fell in the night and shattered on the flagstones. Mrs. Grimes looked at it in the morning with an expression that contained several things at once: practical assessment, a long accumulating exasperation, and something that might have been grief if she had permitted it that dignity. She reported it to Creel, who said he would see to it, and did not. She did not report it to the Duke because it was not, in the ordinary arrangement of a great house, her place to bring building matters directly to the master. This was how things went at Westridge that winter. The structure noting its own decline, in the language of fallen plaster and sticking latches, and the message never quite arriving where it needed to. Margaret swept the debris without being asked, borrowed a bucket and mixed a rough plaster from lime she found in the estate stores, and filled the gap herself during the early morning before the household woke. It was not expert work. It would need doing properly in spring, but it would hold the cold out until then, which was the most that could be asked of it. Mrs. Grimes watched her do it from the passage doorway, her candle in one hand, her other hand at her side. She watched for perhaps a full minute without speaking. Then she went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and when Margaret came in with the lime still on her hands, she set a cup of tea on the table without comment. The good tea, from the caddy she kept on the high shelf. Not the blended dust that went to the general servant's breakfast. Margaret looked at the cup, and then at Mrs. Grimes. And Mrs. Grimes turned to the range and said, "The Duke takes his breakfast at 9 when he comes down. He has not come down before 10 in 3 weeks. I mention it in case the timing is relevant to anything." It was the most Mrs. Grimes had ever said to her at once. Outside, the frost lay bone white on the park, and the path north was there, if you knew where to find it. And somewhere at the far edge of the dark larch plantation, a small column of chimney smoke was rising and being taken sideways at once by the wind off the high ground. Present, gone, present again, the way a thing persists when it has decided to. Whether the Duke had seen it from his window was not yet a question Margaret had thought to ask. But Henderson had noticed her watching the library windows that morning as she crossed the yard with the ash bucket, and he had said nothing about it, which was its own kind of answer, and the question of what the man behind that window had decided, or had not yet decided, sat in the cold air of Westridge like the unresolved crack in the kitchen ceiling, waiting for spring, or for whatever came first. The Duke waited 4 days before he followed her. He did not plan it, or rather, he planned it in the way that a man plans things he has not yet admitted to himself. Incremental, sideways, arriving at the act only once every preparatory step had been taken. He noted, without announcing that he was noting, the hour at which the back door latch lifted on the nights Margaret went out. He discovered, casually, in a conversation with Henderson about the state of the North Drive's drainage, that the keeper's cottage had a sound roof and a workable hearth, and had been standing empty these 3 years. He pulled from the library shelf the survey map his grandfather had commissioned in 1771, spread it on the writing table, and studied the North Park in the particular way of a man who is telling himself he is thinking about drainage while thinking about something else entirely. On the 4th night, the frost had thinned to a cold, dry clarity, and he pulled on his riding coat and went out. He did not take a lantern. He did not need one, The stars were hard and plentiful, and the snow in the park's open ground threw back enough light to walk by. He moved along the edge of the beach row rather than across the open ground, which kept him in shadow and was also, if he was honest with himself, less likely to be seen from the cottage window. The larch plantation was black at its edges and darker inside, and he picked the footpath through it by feel and instinct, both hands out of his pockets. The plank bridge across the drainage ditch was there. He crossed it without incident and came out of the larches onto the last quarter-mile of open ground before the cottage. Her light was already in the window. He stopped 20 yards back at the edge of the last tree cover and stood. The cottage window threw a yellow rectangle onto the frost, and within it, imprecisely, through old glass that had gone to whirls at its edges, he could see two shapes. One was still. One moved. He watched the shape that moved for a long time before he understood what he was seeing. Margaret, kneeling at the hearth, building up a fire from almost nothing, and then turning back to kneel beside someone on a pallet, and the angle of her head, tipped forward, intent, was the angle of someone listening for breath. He had not let himself imagine, precisely, what he expected to find. He had constructed a plausible story for the light that involved a lover or a piece of private commerce or simply solitude, anything, in other words, that would have been straightforwardly comprehensible and therefore manageable. What he was watching was none of those things. What he was watching was a woman keeping a man alive. The man on the pallet shifted. There was a crutch against the wall. The crutch had something carved on its handle. He was too far to see what, but the shape of it, the care of it, told him enough about how the long hours were being spent in that stone room. He stayed for perhaps a quarter of an hour. He did not approach the door. When he turned and walked back through the larches and across the frozen park toward Westridge, his hands were in his coat pockets and his face was doing nothing at all, which was how he looked when something had gone past the reach of expression. His brother Harry had died in a redoubt outside Badajoz on a Tuesday in April, with the mud and without a surgeon. This was what the letter had said, stripped of the language of administration it had used to say it. There had been a man beside him, the letter noted, a private from a Shropshire regiment who had held Harry's hand because that was what was available. The Duke had read this fact and then put the letter in the drawer of his father's writing desk, and not opened the drawer since. He had been in Yorkshire when Harry died. He had been at Westridge, in this house, eating off this table, sleeping in these rooms, moving through these passages. He had been entirely safe. He had stayed safe because the estate had needed managing, and Harry had been the soldier, and neither of them had questioned the arrangement because it was the arrangement that made sense. Harry was the elder, born to inherit, and when the inheritance had been transferred by misfortune to the younger brother, it had seemed even more necessary that Alistair remain to discharge the obligation. None of this had been wrong, exactly. It had all made sense in the accounting of it. It had still left Harry dying in the mud with a stranger's hand in his, while Alistair sat in the library with the fire too high, reading about campaigns he had never been part of. Margaret Felbridge had left the comfort of whatever life she had managed to make, and had come to a fading house at the edge of the moor, and stolen bread, and burned her own clothing, and walked through sleet in the dark, and was kneeling tonight beside her brother, rather than permitting him to die alone in a cottage where no one would find him until spring. Alistair stood in the library until nearly 2 in the morning. He did not open the drawer with Harry's letter. He wrote 2 letters of his own, sealed them himself without calling for the footman, and left them on the hall table for the post. The first was to a man in York named Dr. Edmund Hawkins, who had served as a regimental surgeon in the peninsula until a musket ball had taken his left kneecap, and the army had declared him finished and thanked him with a pension that covered roughly a third of his actual expenses. The letter was brief and careful. and contained a sum of money that would have surprised Dr. Hawkins had he not been, by temperament and by long experience of what money could and could not move, largely unsurprisable. The patient's name in the letter was given as T. Fielding. The address was described only as a keeper's cottage on the north park of a private estate in the West Riding, and the Duke would meet him on the Harrogate Road to guide the last mile. The second letter went to a glazier in the nearest market town. He said nothing to Margaret. He said nothing to Mrs. Grimes, though he stopped in the kitchen passage the following morning under the pretext of asking about the household accounts, and looked at the ceiling where the plaster had been repaired, and the look he gave it held something that might have been the beginning of paying attention. Mrs. Grimes said nothing about the repair. She handed him the quarterly accounts and met his eye with the level composure of a woman who has decided to wait and see what a man does next before she revises her estimate of him. He did not revise her accounts. He asked 2 questions about the coal supplier, pointed questions, the kind that indicated he already suspected what the answers would be, and took the papers away. Creel was not summoned that week. He would be, Margaret would learn later, but not yet. That reckoning moved at the pace of the Duke's own careful accumulation of evidence, and he had learned from watching Margaret that a thing could be prepared for over weeks without its object suspecting, provided you remained invisible. The provision basket appeared on the 3rd day. It was there at the scullery door when the night footman came to bank the kitchen fire. A willow basket with a cloth over it, set to one side of the step as though left by a tradesman, containing a cut of cold beef, 3 good loaves, a paper of tea, and a jar of the kind of clear broth that requires 6 hours and a sound stockpot to achieve. No note, no marker of origin. Margaret found it before the footman could ask about it and moved it with the canvas bag before the morning staff arrived. She said nothing. She put the beef in the bag and went about her work, and watched every face that morning for a sign of knowledge, and found nothing she could read. Dr. Hawkins arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered to the North Park footpath by the Duke's own gig, which was used, officially, for errands in the nearest town, and whose driver Henderson had selected with the particular discretion of a man who had twice been entrusted with things that were not his business, and had discharged both trusts without incident. The doctor had a compact, ironic face, a greying moustache kept neat with the habit of a former officer, and a walk that accommodated his rebuilt knee with such practised efficiency that you noticed it only by its absence, by the slight compensation in the opposite hip, so familiar he no longer registered it as compensation. He had brought a leather medical bag that smelled of camphor and old leather, scuffed at the corners in a way that said this bag had been in worse places than a Yorkshire moor, and had not found it necessary to make a fuss. He examined Tom's leg for 20 minutes without speaking, except to ask Tom twice to tell him where the pain was sharpest, and once to ask whether the brake had been set at all or left. He then sat back on the stool that was the cottage's only other furniture, and told Tom what he could do, and when, and in what order, in the precise and undecorated language of a man who had long since concluded that false comfort helped no one, and that accurate information, delivered with reasonable warmth, was the greatest service available. Tom listened with the attention of a soldier who knows that orders given once are not generally repeated. After the examination, while the compress Dr. Hawkins had mixed was doing its work, the doctor opened his bag and produced a small volume, octavo, cloth-bound, the cloth worn at the spine, which turned out to be a collected history of the Roman military campaigns, translated from the German. He opened it at the beginning of the chapter on Trajan's Dacian campaign, adjusted his position on the stool with the care of a man respecting his own architectural limitations, and began to read aloud. He read well. He had the voice of a man accustomed to being heard over ambient noise, measured and unhurried. And the narrative, which concerned the engineering of Trajan's bridge and the engineering of Trajan's enemies' response to it, turned out to be, in the event, genuinely arresting. Tom asked a question about the pontoon construction. Dr. Hawkins answered it with the ease of a man who had already read this book several times and had opinions. Tom had an opinion in return. The doctor looked at him with the slight elevation of an eyebrow that was, for him, the equivalent of a broad smile, and said, in a dry tone that carried a decade of military cynicism in it, that Tom Fielding had clearly been wasted as a common soldier and should have been put to engineering, where his evident intelligence could have inconvenienced the French more efficiently. Tom laughed. Not the polite, constrained sound of a man remembering how laughter worked. A real laugh. The laugh of someone genuinely caught off guard by something, arriving too fast to be managed. The Duke was standing outside the cottage door. He had come to check, he told himself, walking across the frost-pale ground in the thin afternoon light, that the doctor had arrived and found the place. He had stopped at the door before he could decide what to announce himself with, because through the gap where the door met its frame, imperfectly, as most things at the cottage's far edge of maintenance were imperfect, he could hear the doctor's voice reading, and then Tom's voice, and then the laugh. He had not heard his brother's name. He had not needed to. The laugh was Harry's laugh, or not Harry's laugh exactly, but the category of laugh that Harry had belonged to. That species of full and unpremeditated amusement that some people have and some do not, and that Alistair had spent 2 years flinching at the memory of. Tom Felbridge had it. Tom Felbridge, lying on a corn-sack mattress in a roofed stone shell on the edge of nowhere, with a broken leg and a false name, and no idea who was paying for the doctor's camphor and the glazier's new glass, had it. The Duke stood outside the door and said nothing, and felt something crack across his chest in a way that was nothing like the cold. He walked back to Westridge when he could. He returned to the library. He did not open the drawer. He sat in the chair by the fire he kept too high and stared at the coals, and understood, with the clarity that arrives only when it has been resisted long enough, that what he was doing was not charity. He could still tell himself it was charity at 1 or 2 removes, the anonymous basket, the intermediary glazier, the doctor with his false patient name. Charity was the construction that made sense of the mechanics. But the reason he had stood outside that door for the length of time he had stood there was not because he wanted to ensure proper medical oversight. He had stood there because Margaret Felbridge had already done something to the particular stillness behind his eyes that had been there since the letter and the physician's visit arrived on the same morning. Had done it without intending to, without even knowing she had access to it, and he had not yet found a way to account for this that satisfied him. He picked up the history of the Iberian campaigns from the side table where he had left it face down. He placed it properly on the shelf. Then he stood in the library in the failing afternoon light and looked at the space the book occupied, and at the drawer he never opened, and at the window through which he had watched a lantern trying to be inconspicuous. Spring was 3 months away. The glazier's new pane had gone in that morning, and the cottage window now threw a clean, undistorted rectangle of light, which was a different quality of light than the old warped glass had produced. He had noticed it from the park on his return. He was not certain that Margaret had yet noticed who had paid for it, or whether she had decided on the evidence available to be certain. He was not ready, precisely, for her to be certain. But the question of what she had suspected, and when, and what she intended to do with the suspicion, that question sat in the library with him in the thinning light, patient and fully present, the way a reckoning sits when it has decided it is willing to wait. The new glass was in the cottage window on a Tuesday morning, and Margaret stood in front of it for a full minute before she moved. She had come at first light, earlier than usual, pushing through the larch plantation in a thin frost that made the ground creak underfoot. She had come because Dr. Hawkins had left a note, slipped under the scullery door in an envelope, addressed in a hand she did not recognise. The note itself saying only that the patient's leg required consistent warmth and that the fire should not be permitted to go cold overnight. And she had been trying to work out how to manage the overnight hours without compromising her position at the house. She had been carrying this problem for 2 days, turning it like a stone in a pocket, and it had not resolved. The window resolved something else. The old glass had been warped at its edges, its surface irregular, in the way of old panes that have settled unevenly over years, the view through them milky and distorted. She had stuffed the gap in the casement with oiled wool herself in October, because the gap let the wind in at a particular angle that was worse than the general cold of the room. The new pane was clear. The lead cane was fresh. The wool stuffing was gone, and in its place was proper glazier's putty, still faintly pale at the edges where it had not yet weathered. It was good work, not estate maintenance work, the rough, efficient kind that Creel's contracted men produced when they could be persuaded to come at all. But careful work, the kind that someone had asked for and supervised. She stood in front of it and thought about the provision basket, which had now appeared 4 times, each time without note, and each time containing exactly what was most needed, rather than what was most easily assembled. She thought about Dr. Hawkins, who had never once asked where his payment was coming from, and who deflected her careful questions about his engagement with the cheerful impenetrability of a man who has been told to deflect them. She thought about the basket's contents, the beef, the broth, and once a small packet of the willow bark preparation that Dr. Hawkins had mentioned, in passing during his second visit, would help with the leg's inflammation. In passing, during a visit she had not been present for. Someone had been present for it. Someone had listened to Dr. Hawkins and gone away and acquired the willow bark and put it in the basket. Margaret was not a person who required extensive evidence to reach a conclusion. She required accurate evidence. She had it now. She looked at the clean, clear glass and at Tom's face visible through it. He was awake, sitting up against the wall, the carved Merlin crutch across his knees. And when he saw her standing outside, he lifted one hand in greeting, and she felt something shift in her chest that was not relief, and was not gratitude, and did not, at the moment, have a name she was prepared to give it. She filed it away and went inside. She said nothing to Tom about what she suspected. Tom had enough to manage without the additional weight of obligation, and she had not yet determined what she intended to do with what she knew. This was how she operated. She accumulated her certainties in private until she understood what she meant to do with them, and then she acted. She was not her father, who had spoken first and calculated the consequences second, and died owing money to men who had been his friends at dinner and his adversaries by dessert. The Dowager Duchess of Dunwood had come to Westridge in January. Margaret learned of her arrival the way she learned most things about the house's upper arrangements, from inference and interval, from the activity that preceded an event, rather than from any direct communication. 2 days before the arrival, there had been a fire lit in the East Wing's sitting room for the first time since autumn, and the housemaids sent to prepare the chambers had come back to the servants' hall with the information that the bed there had a carved walnut headboard and a set of initialed silver brushes on the dressing table, and that the mantelpiece held a miniature in an oval frame that might have been a child, or might have been a young officer, depending on how you stood to the light. Margaret filed this detail too. Lady Wilhelmina Dunwood had been 82 years old for long enough that she wore the age with the ease of a garment that has been broken in thoroughly. She was 4 feet 11 inches of assembled consequence, small enough that newcomers occasionally made the mistake of calibrating their deference by her physical dimensions rather than by the quality of her attention, and always regretted it. She had outlived 2 kings, 4 physicians who had advised her to reduce her activities, and a husband whose primary contribution to the family's history, she was known to observe, had been the excellent cellar he had laid down in 1787 before dying inconveniently soon thereafter. She carried a cane of black lacquered wood, not because she needed it for balance, but because it gave her something authoritative to do with her right hand, and she had long since concluded that an authoritative right hand was worth more in most situations than a free one. She summoned Margaret on her third day at Westridge. Mrs. Grimes delivered the summons with a flatness of expression that contained, Margaret had learned to read, several layers of commentary that politeness required her not to articulate. Margaret went up to the east wing at the appointed hour and was shown in by the Dowager's own maid, an ancient woman named Pell, who had served Lady Wilhelmina for 40 years and communicated almost exclusively in significant silences. The room was warm, genuinely warm. The first room in Westridge that Margaret had entered since December that had achieved actual warmth, rather than the reduced cold that passed for it in the rest of the house. The Dowager was in a wing-back chair, angled to the fire, dressed for an afternoon at home in dark green silk that had the luminous quality of fabric that has been well kept for a long time. On the table beside her was a volume in blue buckram, and beside the volume, a small object that caught the light from the window. A silver thimble, worn smooth. The kind of object that lives in a pocket rather than a case, and is handled so often its original engraving has become a suggestion rather than a legible inscription. "Sit," said the Dowager, without preamble. "Read." She placed the blue buckram volume on the footstool in front of Margaret's chair. The title, pressed in faded gilt, A History of Fallen Houses, being an account of noble families extinguished through war, debt, and misfortune. 1600, 1780. It was precisely as dry as it sounded. Margaret opened to the chapter Lady Wilhelmina indicated. A survey of the 3rd Earl of Castlemaine's estate dissolution in 1743, which involved a long accounting of entail disputes, creditor claims, and the particular cruelty of the law of distraint as applied to a house with young children in it, and read. She could not help herself. She had never been able to help herself with this particular kind of text, not because she enjoyed accounting, but because behind every column of figures in a legal dissolution, there was a household. And behind every household, there were people who had got up in the morning with different expectations than those with which they went to bed. And the gap between the expectation and the fact was the most human thing in any document, and she could hear it when she read. Her voice did not perform the emotion. It simply followed the sentence's actual weight, neither flattening it nor embellishing it. And the result was that a survey of entail law became, in the reading, a story about a family. Lady Wilhelmina listened with her eyes closed and her right hand resting on the black cane. At the end of the chapter, she said, "Stop." And then, after a pause during which the fire settled and the room was very quiet, "Who taught you to read like that?" "My father," Margaret said. "And your father was?" "A man who believed that education was worth more than it cost him." She kept her voice level. "He was right about the value, he miscalculated the cost." The Dowager opened her eyes. They were still dark, still precise. The eyes of someone who had been measuring things for 8 decades and had gotten very good at it. She looked at Margaret for a long moment with the unself-conscious directness of great age, which has shed the social compunction to make assessment invisible. "You will come to me at 10 each morning," she said. "You will read for 1 hour. You will also be available in the afternoons if I require correspondence managed." She picked up the silver thimble, turned it once between her fingers without looking at it, and set it down. "Tell Mrs. Grimes I have requested this arrangement. She will know what it means in terms of your other duties." Margaret understood what it meant. It meant a footing. It meant a category that was not housemaid and not servant in the ordinary sense, a category that afforded a degree of presence and movement in the house's upper rooms that no other arrangement available to her would have provided. She did not know whether Lady Wilhelmina had done this entirely on her own recognition, or whether some other hand had arranged the introduction, and she decided, for the moment, not to investigate the question too closely. The East Wing sitting room became, over the following weeks, the best part of Margaret's days at Westridge. She moved the dowager's chaise 3 inches toward the fire. This required some negotiation, framed as a practical suggestion about the morning light, until Lady Wilhelmina conceded that the positioning was in fact improved, and she found a child's portrait in the passage outside the room, a small oil-on panel in a frame that had gone dark with age, and hung it on the east wall where the morning light from the window reached it at 9 o'clock and made it glow. The portrait was of a boy of perhaps 7 years, dark-haired, in a blue coat, with an expression of absolute self-possessed solemnity that was both charming and faintly heartbreaking. The dowager looked at it the first morning it hung there without saying anything, and Pell, bringing the tea tray, looked at it, and then at her mistress, and made the particular significant silence that meant she understood. Jenny was the scullery maid, who could not speak to her supervisor without her words colliding at the start, the consonants stalling and restarting, with a determination that was entirely her own, and never asked for patience, even when patience was what the collision required. She was 17 and slight, and had a way of moving through the kitchen passages close to the wall, as though minimising her claim on the available space. She made pastry with her eyes closed, not literally, but nearly, with the kind of absorbed physical intelligence that does not require watching what the hands are doing, and the result was a short crust of a quality that silently indicted everything that had come out of Westridge's kitchen for the past 2 years. Mrs. Grimes had been covering for Jenny's stutter with the kitchen's male staff in small, specific ways that Jenny probably knew about and had never acknowledged. Margaret knew about it too, and she and Jenny arrived at a working friendship through the particular route of 2 people who have each observed something and agreed without discussion to behave as though the observation is a private matter. It was Jenny who brought the letter. She appeared at the door of the dowager's sitting room on a Wednesday morning in early March, holding an envelope addressed to Margaret in Dr. Hawkins's hand. She had recognised the address from the envelopes that came to the scullery door, Margaret understood later, and she said, with a minimal hesitation at the first syllable, "Post came. I thought you'd want it before anyone else saw the name on it." The letter was from Dr. Hawkins, and it enclosed a second letter, a note from Major Gerald Fortescue, commanding officer of Tom's former regiment, confirming that the outstanding debts registered against Private Thomas Felbridge, 4 notes of hand with a Sheffield moneylender named Rook, totalling £63, and a sutler's claim of disputed validity, had been discharged in full on the 21st of February by an anonymous settlement, paid through a Leeds solicitor retained for that specific purpose. £63 was 8 months of Margaret's wages, and she had not paid it. She held the letter for a moment, then folded it and placed it in her apron pocket. She thanked Jenny, who nodded once with the efficiency of someone who has delivered the thing and considers the transaction complete, and left. Margaret already knew, with the clarity of a conclusion long assembled, whose solicitor in Leeds it was. She had spent 3 weeks accumulating the knowledge that the Duke had been behind the basket, and the glazier, and the doctor, and she had made her peace with each piece as it arrived. The debt settlement was different. The debt settlement was £63, and it had required going to a solicitor and obtaining the names of the creditors and arranging the transfer, which was not an act of passing charity, but an act of deliberate, thorough intervention. It was the act of someone who had taken her problem and solved it at its root, without telling her it was being solved, which meant he had done it entirely without expectation of acknowledgement. She found the Duke in the walled garden. She had not planned it for that afternoon, but she had known, when she put the letter in her pocket, that she was not going to carry this particular certainty with her any longer than necessary. He was there because the walled garden was where the south-facing wall held the warmth long enough to make March tolerable. And he had taken to walking there in the early afternoons. She knew this from Mrs. Grimes, who mentioned it the way she mentioned everything useful. Without emphasis, at a tangential moment, apparently about something else. He was standing at the far end with his back to the gate, looking at the espaliered pair that had been trained against the old stone for 40 years, and was now the only thing in the kitchen garden that was genuinely thriving. Margaret's hands were dark with soil from the cold frames. She had stopped at the cold frames on her way, and was not certain whether this had been unconscious or whether she had needed, specifically, something to look at while she walked. She stopped at a reasonable distance from him and said, without preamble, because preamble would have been a concession she was not prepared to make. "You paid Rook's notes. And the sutler." The Duke turned around. He did not look surprised. He looked instead like a man who has known a conversation was coming and has had time to decide what he is and is not willing to say in it. His coat was dark and plain, the cravat less formally tied than anything the house's protocols required. He had come to walk, not to be seen. He looked at her hands and at the letter, which she was holding with the soil-dark fingers, and said nothing. "You should have told me," she said. "Why?" "Because it is my problem. Because Tom is my brother, and his debts are my. I know whose debts they were." The quiet way he said it stopped her. Not dismissively. There was nothing dismissive in his voice, but with a finality that was not the finality of ending a subject, but of having arrived at the only thing that actually needed to be said. "Why did you not tell me?" she said. Her voice was level. She had made it level. He looked at the espaliered pair for a moment, as though consulting it, and then back at her. "Because you would have thanked me," he said, "and I could not bear it." The walled garden was very quiet. A wood pigeon somewhere beyond the south wall made its repetitive sound, and the thin March sun lay on the old stone with the tentative quality of warmth that has not yet committed to staying. Margaret stood with her soil-dark hands at her sides and looked at the Duke of Dunwood, and understood, with the precision of something that has been true for longer than she realised, and is only now becoming available to conscious examination, exactly what he had meant. Not the words, which were simple enough, but the reason behind them. The thing he was describing about himself, when he said, "I could not bear it." He had not wanted her gratitude. He had given without wanting to be known as the giver. In 31 years of watching men perform generosity, her father's generous friends who had lent money with interest written in invisible ink, the patrons at church whose donations arrived with attached conditions too numerous to list. She had never encountered this particular configuration before, and she did not know what to do with it. She did not say anything else. She turned and walked back through the walled garden gate, and she kept walking. And she did not let herself think, not yet, about the fact that her hands were shaking, not from cold, not from anger, but from something that did not have a comfortable name, and that she was not, at this moment, at all certain she was prepared to allow. What she was prepared for, she discovered as she re-entered the house through the kitchen passage, was considerably less than the situation seemed to require. And in the east wing, Lady Wilhelmina sat by her warm fire with the silver thimble in her closed hand, and waited to see what a careful young woman would do next, with something she had not expected to receive. Spring came to Westridge late, and then all at once, the way it does in the high country. A fortnight of cold, grey hesitation, and then a single warm week that brought everything up together, the blackthorn and the larches, and the first tentative smoke from the tenant cottages, switching from coal to wood, as people remembered there was another fuel. The park turned green in the space of 4 days. The drainage ditch that Margaret crossed 3 times a week showed a thread of actual water in it for the first time since she had arrived. The Dowager decided to go to London on the first genuinely warm morning, which Margaret understood from long observation was not coincidence. Lady Wilhelmina made her major decisions in good weather, the way some generals prefer to review their forces in clear light. She summoned Pell to begin the trunk inventory and informed Mrs. Grimes, via a note delivered by the ancient maid with the solemnity of a diplomatic communication, that the household should prepare for her departure in a fortnight's time. She then summoned Margaret and told her, without framing it as a question, that she would be coming. "You'll need clothes," the Dowager said. She was looking at Margaret's grey wool with the critical appraisal of a woman who had spent 60 years understanding how dress communicated rank and was therefore attuned to every way in which Margaret's current attire communicated the wrong one. A companion in housemaid's grey is an advertisement for economies I have not made. Pell will take you to the seamstress in town on Thursday. What Pell and the seamstress in town produced, over 2 days of silent and efficient collaboration, was a walking dress in deep blue-grey wool, a spencer to go over it in darker charcoal with jet buttons, and a second dress in plain cream muslin for evening occasions. Nothing fashionable in the London sense, nothing that would draw attention to itself, but everything that would make clear that the young woman wearing it was not available to be dismissed. The Dowager inspected the results, with the silver thimble turning in her fingers, and said only, "Better," which, from Lady Wilhelmina, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Margaret packed her canvas bag alongside the new garments and did not look at the bag as a different kind of object than she had looked at it in December. The canvas was the same canvas. She was, she reminded herself, the same person. London was temporary. Tom was in the cottage, his leg properly set now, doctor. Hawkins calling weekly, the standing basket still appearing at the scullery door with a regularity that required someone at Westridge to maintain the instruction, which meant that the Duke's arrangements continued even in his absence, which was its own kind of information. The Duke of Dunwood had arrived in London in late March, 2 weeks ahead of the Dowager's party, because the season began its real business in April, and because there were obligations attached to his rank that persisted regardless of his inclination toward them. Margaret knew this not from the Duke himself. They had not spoken directly since the walled garden, and the walled garden had not yet resolved into anything she understood how to carry forward, but from the Dowager, who mentioned her grandson's movements with the matter-of-fact frequency of a general tracking force dispositions. They arrived in Bruton Street on a Tuesday afternoon to a house that smelled of beeswax and fresh linen, and the specific metropolitan quality of coal smoke layered over stone, which is London's particular atmosphere, and distinguishable from Yorkshire's, even with your eyes closed. The Dowager's London establishment was smaller than Westridge, and in considerably better repair. Managed by a housekeeper named Mrs. Carver, who had the vigilant precision of a person who knows she will be compared to a legendary predecessor and has spent 15 years making certain the comparison does not disadvantage her. Margaret had her own small room at the back of the house, which looked out over the Mews, and on the first evening she sat in it and listened to the city, the carriage wheels on the cobbles, the calls of the street sellers in the square, a dog dispute resolving itself 2 streets over, and thought about a stone cottage at the edge of a dark larch plantation, and a fire that now did not go cold overnight because someone had arranged for it not to. She allowed herself to think about this for exactly as long as it took her candle to burn down 1 inch, which she measured against the mark she had made on it with her thumbnail, and then she closed the thought as she would close a book she intended to return to, and went to sleep. The Duke called on his grandmother 3 days after the Dowager's arrival. Margaret was in the sitting room when he arrived, reading aloud from a collection of letters by a deceased bluestocking of Lady Wilhelmina's acquaintance, whose correspondence turned out to be sharp-edged and intermittently brilliant. She heard his step in the hall. She acknowledged to herself, learned to identify his step, which had a particular unhurried weight to it, distinguishable from the lighter tread of the footman. And she reached the end of her paragraph and stopped. He came in and greeted his grandmother with the contained formality that was his default with her, which Lady Wilhelmina received with the mild impatience of a woman who has been watching this man withhold himself since he was 9 years old and has not yet lost hope of a thaw. He looked at Margaret and said, with precise courtesy, "Miss Felbridge." She said, with equal precision, "Your Grace." The Dowager watched both of them with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to be amused, and then asked her grandson about the state of the parliamentary calendar, and the moment passed. But the room, after he sat down, had a different quality than it had had before. Margaret returned to the letters and read on. And the words she was reading were about the cultivation of intellectual friendship between women of different rank. And she attended to them with the particular focus of someone who is also attending to something else. She did not look at him. She had become quite good at not looking at him. Lady Celeste Marbury had been not looking at the Duke of Dunwood for 2 years, and the effort had cost her considerably more than she had originally estimated. She was 24, and she had the beauty of a woman who has been told since childhood that beauty is a negotiable instrument, and has spent the intervening years learning the financial system it operates within. Her father, Lord Marbury, had debts that were known in the relevant circles with the sad familiarity of a recurring ailment. Large, chronic, not quite fatal, requiring constant management. The management required money. The money required a marriage, and the marriage required the right man. And the right man, solvent, titled, young enough to be credible, old enough to be manageable, was, in Celeste's considered assessment, the Duke of Dunwood, who was all of these things, and who had additionally shown no interest whatsoever in marrying anyone, which she had originally interpreted as a challenge, and had since revised to a more complicated problem. She had been watching Westridge. Not literally, she was not so crude as that. But she had maintained, through a network of the small social intelligences that circulate among households connected by trade and staff, and the particular proximity of country neighbours, a general awareness of the estate's condition and the Duke's movements. She had known about Creel for longer than the Duke had, because Creel's card-playing companions included the younger son of a baronet, whose sister had married a man who dined with Lord Marbury, and the information had travelled a path of 4 conversational steps in the span of a winter. She had known about the new arrangements at the keeper's cottage with rather less precision. Someone's undergroom had mentioned a doctored horse that turned out not to be a horse at all, and the particulars had sharpened themselves over several weeks into something resembling a useful fact. A soldier. A brother. Bread from the larder, taken without permission. She was not, to give her what credit the situation allows, stupid about what she had. She knew the information was not itself damaging to the Duke. It was, if anything, to his credit, and she was not planning to damage him. What it was useful for was Margaret Felbridge, who stood between Celeste and the conversation she needed to have, and who needed to be removed from that position before she became something more permanent than a companion. The man she found for the purpose was Mr. Algernon Thorne, who wrote occasional verse for 2 of the lesser journals and a satirical column for a publication that positioned itself at the precise intersection of the fashionable and the scandalous. He was 30, thin, with an ambitious mouth and a vanity that was only barely subordinate to his intelligence. And he and Celeste arrived at their arrangement through the medium of a supper party where she had been placed next to him and had spent 1 hour demonstrating that she found his opinions interesting and another hour demonstrating that she was in a position to make the opinions of people she found interesting materially more comfortable. The result appeared in print in the third week of April under the title A Yorkshire Pastoral, which was 4 stanzas of apparently general social satire about northern housemaids with pretensions, each stanza ending with a couplet about bread taken from another's table. The names were absent. The details were present. Anyone who had heard anything recognised it immediately, and recognition spread with the pleasant velocity of a thing that costs the reader nothing. Margaret first saw it in the hands of one of the Dowager's morning callers, a Mrs. Pendleton, whose goodwill was genuine and whose inability to suppress information was equally genuine, and who left it on the side table when she departed without appearing to realise she had done so. Margaret picked it up, read it once, set it down. She noted the publication, the column, the approximate cost of the information to whoever had provided it. She had the whole picture within 40 minutes, and she went to her small room in the mews facing back of the house, and sat on the bed for precisely as long as it took her to arrive at the conclusion that anger, while entirely warranted, was a luxury she could not presently afford. She told the Dowager that evening, which meant the Dowager knew everything before the musicale. The musicale was held in the first week of May at the Portman Square house of a Lady Ashworth, who had 3 daughters and a genuine passion for Italian opera, and who organised these evenings with the combination of artistic sincerity and social calculation that was the characteristic mode of London's serious hostesses. The rooms were full, perhaps 80 people arranged on hired chairs and standing at the margins, and the soprano performing the evening's programme was Neapolitan and excellent. Between the first and second halves of the programme, the guests moved through to the supper room, and it was there, in the particular social density of people displaced from seats into standing, that Celeste Marbury found her opening. Margaret was standing near the window with a glass she was not drinking from, occupying the particular zone of a companion who is present and attending, but not participating in the principal social currents. The Dowager was across the room, seated, with 3 women of her generation arranged around her in the natural formation of a court. The Duke was, Margaret had established this early in the evening, as she established it in every room, near the door, in conversation with 2 men whose bearing suggested military history, his back partly to the rest of the company. He did not know what was in the room yet. Celeste approached from the left, arriving into Margaret's immediate vicinity with the practised naturalness of a woman who has staged entrances since she was 16. She was in white muslin with a gold trim at the hem, a strand of coral at her throat, and her dark hair dressed high. She was, objectively, beautiful, and she was aware of this, with the quiet efficiency of a surgeon aware of a useful instrument. "Miss Felbridge," she said, with the warm surprise of someone delighted to encounter an unexpected acquaintance. She said it at a pitch that was perfectly calibrated, audible for 6 feet in every direction. Not so loud as to announce itself as a performance. Several heads turned, which was the intention. "Lady Celeste," Margaret said, "I was so glad to hear you've settled well in the Dowager's establishment." The smile held with complete technical competence. "You've quite made yourself indispensable, I understand. And your brother, how does he find his new quarters? I recall the cottage had no proper bed when it stood empty." A brief, light pause. The pause of someone who is not quite finished. "But then, I suppose he was never meant to stay." The room in the immediate vicinity went quiet in the spreading way of rooms that have caught the scent of something happening. Margaret held the glass she was not drinking from and looked at Celeste Marbury and felt, with complete precision, the shape of what was being done. The verse in the column had been preparatory, an instrument of ambient damage, designed so that by the time the public question arrived, the audience would already have the tune. Celeste had built the context first, and the confrontations second, which was sophisticated work, and Margaret acknowledged it internally with the brief, cold respect one owes to competent opposition. She said, calmly and with perfect audibility, "My brother finds the moor air beneficial to his recovery, as the surgeon attending him has confirmed. Soldiers who have served in the peninsula often do." She paused, the same beat that Celeste had paused. "The Duke of Dunwood has been generous in his attention to the welfare of the Westridge estate and all those connected to it. I believe that quality of stewardship reflects well on the house. It was not a performance of dignity. It was simply the register of a woman who had been raised to handle a dinner table that was being carried out the door, and had learned, in that education, that the way you spoke when everything was going wrong was the truest signal of who you actually were." The silence lasted 2 full seconds, which in a room of 80 people is a very long time. "My dear," Lady Wilhelmina's voice, from across the room, did not raise itself. It did not need to. She had spent 82 years developing a voice that carried by quality rather than volume, and the quality it carried now was the particular tone of a very old and very powerful woman who has decided to end something. "The keeper's cottage was rebuilt on my own instruction," the dowager said, from her chair, with the finality of an announcement read from a document. "As anyone familiar with the management of Westridge's North Park would be aware, the arrangements there are a matter of family decision, not a subject for general curiosity." She looked at the room, not at Celeste specifically, but at the whole room, which was both more comprehensive and more devastating. "I find I shall want to remember who was present this evening." The silver thimble turned once in her fingers, a private gesture visible only to those close enough to see it. "Shall we return to the music? I believe the soprano has more to give us." The room returned to the music. Celeste returned to her place on the hired chairs with the composed expression of a woman who has sustained a blow and has decided that the composed expression is the only available response. She did not look at Margaret again. She did not look at the Duke, who had turned from his conversation near the door at the sound of the dowager's voice, and had understood, from the posture of the room and from Margaret's stillness near the window, the shape of what had just occurred, though not yet the full content, not yet the verse in the column, or the specific words that had preceded the dowager's intervention. He looked at Margaret across the room of resettling guests, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything. And then the soprano began to sing again, and the moment closed over them like water. Celeste Marbury sat in her chair and listened to the Neapolitan soprano, and understood with the cold clarity of someone recalculating that the public approach had failed, and that she had one instrument remaining. A letter she had obtained through a route she preferred not to examine too closely, in handwriting she had given some care to studying, which she had not yet deployed because she had not yet needed it. She had thought it a last resort. It was now the only resort, and she would need to move before the season ended and the Dunwood party returned to Yorkshire, taking Margaret Felbridge and the dowager's protection with them. What the Duke held, on his side of the closed moment, was the sight of Margaret standing by the window of Lady Ashworth's supper room with an untouched glass in her hand, and her spine straight, and her expression giving nothing away, and what Celeste had attempted, and what it told him about how visible Margaret had become, and how exposed, and why. He had not yet understood all of what he was going to do about it, but he understood, standing by the door with the soprano's voice opening again above the assembled company, that the question of what he was going to do about it was no longer a question he could defer. The Westridge ball had last been held 2 years before the new Duke inherited it, in the time of his father, when the chandelier in the great room had burned all 40 of its candles, and the fiddlers from Harrogate had played until 3 in the morning, and the windows had fogged with the warmth of 200 people who were, for one evening, entirely persuaded that the world was as it should be. The chandelier had been shrouded in Holland cloth since then. The fiddlers had been engaged for other houses. The great room had served, in the intervening years, as a large and echoic repository for furniture that had no other place to be. Mrs. Grimes had proposed restaging the ball in June in the way she proposed things she had already decided, as a practical suggestion, with the household implications fully mapped and the objections anticipated. She had brought it to the Duke after his return from London, in the first week of May, setting the proposal on his writing table in the library alongside the quarterly accounts and the glazier's final invoice, which she had obtained from the estate records with a thoroughness that indicated she considered the context relevant. He had looked at the accounts, at all of it, at Creel's private ledger, which had been added to the pile by the solicitor from Leeds 2 days earlier, and said yes. Creel had been gone from Westridge since the 2nd week of April. He had not been dismissed loudly. He had been presented, in a meeting in the library that had lasted 20 minutes, with a summary of the private ledger's arithmetic and offered a choice between quiet departure and a conversation with a magistrate. He had chosen the departure, with the speed of a man who has been preparing for this specific moment and is relieved it has finally arrived. His office was cleared within the day. The position of steward was not immediately filled, which was itself a statement. The Duke had taken the household accounts into his own direct management, which had required 3 weeks of intensive reconciliation and had produced in him the expression of a man who has been told an unpleasant truth about a house he loves and has decided to treat the truth as a starting point rather than a conclusion. The chandelier was unhoused from its Holland cloth on the 15th of June by Henderson and 2 grooms on a ladder arrangement that required more engineering than it appeared. The candle sockets were cleaned and relined. The windows in the great room were reglazed, all of them, not just the one Mrs. Grimes had flagged, because the Duke had walked the room himself in May and made his own list. The carpet runners were beaten and returned. The silver came up from the strong room for the first time in 2 years and was polished by Jenny and 2 other scullery maids over 3 days, Jenny working with the same closed-eye absorption she brought to pastry, the silver acquiring under her hands a quality of attention it had not received in some time. Tom's crutch was on his knee and not under his arm on the morning of the ball. Dr. Hawkins had been working toward this for 2 months, with the methodical patience of a man who has seen worse injuries recover further than expected, and has learned to treat prognosis as a probability rather than a sentence. The leg would always carry the memory of the break, a slight asymmetry in the gait, the doctor said, that in a few years would be indistinguishable from the ordinary variation of a man who spent his 20s in difficult terrain. Tom had received this information with the particular gratitude of someone who had, in the cottage's longest winter nights, made his private accounting of what was gone and what remained, and had arrived at a number he could work with. He would not attend the ball. He was not ready for a room of 200 people, and the noise and the heat and the accumulated social weight of a county event. And he and Margaret had discussed this with the practical honesty that had always been their mode with each other. He would be at the cottage. Henderson had arranged for one of the younger grooms to sit with him that evening, a quiet boy named Will, who had been bringing Tom books from the Westridge Library for 6 weeks, and had developed the habit of staying to discuss them, which was a kindness so natural that neither of them had named it. Margaret dressed for the ball in the blue-grey wool that the seamstress in town had made for her in March, which was not a ball gown and was not trying to be, and which was precisely right for someone who was the dowager's companion and not a guest, attending in a capacity that required presence and not performance. Pell put her hair up with the economical expertise of a woman who considers unnecessary ornament a form of insincerity. The dowager looked at the result and said, with the silver thimble in her hand, "Good." Then she added, which was unusual for her, "Your father would have found this evening entirely satisfying." She did not explain what she meant by this, and Margaret did not ask, and the thimble went into the dowager's pocket, where it always lived. The great room, when Margaret entered it ahead of the dowager's chair, was as it had been designed to be, and had not been for years. Lit, warm, populated with the particular quality of human density that turns a room from architecture into occasion. The chandelier was extraordinary. She had not expected it to be extraordinary. She had known it was there, had seen it swathed in cloth, had cleaned the floor beneath it monthly without particularly imagining it at full operation. At full operation, with all 40 candles burning and the pendants moving in the warmth of 200 people, it was something that the room had clearly been built around and had been waiting to justify. She stood for a moment just inside the entrance, because the sight required a moment, and then she moved to her position beside the dowager's chair near the east wall and attended to the room with the divided attention that the evening required. One part social awareness, tracking the movement of guests, the disposition of the family's particular obligations, the approach of people Lady Wilhelmina would want to see, and the approach of people she would want warned about. Another part, somewhere else entirely. Lady Celeste Marbury arrived at 9:30. She had not been expected. She had been invited. The invitation list had been Mrs. Grimes's domain, compiled from the county's conventional obligations. And Celeste's family had been on those obligations for 2 generations. But in the weeks since the musicale, it had been broadly understood, in the way that social understandings circulate without being stated, that the Dunwood household and the Marbury household had entered a period of reduced warmth. Her appearance at 9:30, in a dress of deep rose silk that was several degrees more formal than the occasion, with her father beside her, and the expression of a woman who has made a decision and arrived at its implementation, was therefore a deliberate act. Margaret saw her come in. The Duke saw her come in. Lady Wilhelmina, who saw everything, continued her conversation with the rector's wife without adjusting her expression by a single degree. What no one else in the room knew, what Margaret had not yet told the Duke, and what the Duke had not yet told Margaret, because the information had arrived separately and the two of them had not been alone together since London, was the following. The letter that Celeste carried in her reticule had been described to Margaret 3 days earlier by a note from a solicitor in Harrogate who had encountered the man who had sold it. It was presented as a letter in Margaret's hand to an unnamed lover, written before her employment at Westridge. It was not in Margaret's hand. Margaret had, between that note's arrival and this evening, written out her own name and the date November 18th, 12, on a sheet of paper and given it to the Duke through Mrs. Grimes, saying only that he should hold it and that he would understand why before the evening was over. The Duke had spent the 3 days since receiving that sheet of paper reviewing everything he knew about November 1812 and arriving at an answer that had stopped him in the library with his hand on the mantelpiece, looking at the drawer he never opened. Celeste moved through the room for an hour. She danced once with a young baronet who was too pleased to have been asked to notice he was being used as positioning. She spoke to 3 groups of people in the particular distributed way of someone preparing an audience rather than enjoying an event. At 10:30, she found her moment. The music between dances, the room at its most fluid, no fixed attention, and she produced the letter. She addressed herself to the Duke directly, which was the calculation she had made, that a public production required the highest status witness, that the Duke's presence guaranteed the room's attention, and that if she could establish the letter's content before he could respond, the response would come too late. She had not entirely miscalculated this. She had miscalculated one thing. "I think," she said, with the careful casualness of something rehearsed to sound unrehearsed, that there is a matter of some relevance to this house that the county ought to be aware of. She held the letter up. A letter from your household's companion, written to a lover, before she came to Westridge under a false character. The room had already begun its attentive quiet. Celeste knew how rooms worked. She had the timing precisely. The Duke took the letter from her hand. This was not what she had expected. She had expected him to decline to touch it or to ask what it was, both of which would have given her the next lines. He simply reached out and took it, with the directness of a man removing something from a position where it could do damage. And he looked at it. He looked at it for a long moment. His face did not change. He had the quality, Margaret had observed over 6 months, of a man whose interior weather was rarely legible from the outside. But she was watching him with the precision of someone who had learned, gradually and without deciding to, the specific vocabulary of his stillness. And she saw the exact moment when the stillness shifted. He knew the handwriting. Of course he knew it. He had read it 100 times on the letters that came from Portugal. The handwriting of a man who formed his capitals with a particular leftward lean, and his lowercase e with an open top. The handwriting of his brother Harry, who had died at Badajoz in April, and whose last letters were in the drawer in the library that the Duke had not opened in 2 years. He knew what the date on the letter was, because Margaret had sent him her own signature and the date, November 18th, 12. And the letter in his hand was dated November 1812. And Harry had been alive in November 1812. He held it for 3 seconds. Then he looked up. "This letter," he said, and his voice in the bright, warm room was very quiet and very even, "was written by my brother, Henry Dunwood, in November of 1812, from the Peninsula, to a member of his regiment." He turned the letter so that the room could see the signature. Not that most of the room could read it from that distance. But the gesture was not for the room to read. It was for the room to understand that he had read it, and that what he was saying was not a defence, but a fact. "My brother died at Badajoz in April of that year. Forgive me, I have for 2 years said 1812 and meant 1813, as anyone who has lost someone will understand." He did not look at Celeste. "The handwriting is his. It is not Miss Felbridge's. I would invite anyone who doubts this to compare it with the letters on file with my solicitor in Leeds." The room was entirely still. He put the letter in his coat pocket, not with anger, with a deliberate, careful placement, as though it had come home from a long distance and he was putting it where it should have been kept. He had not known, this morning, that he was going to put it there. He understood now that he had been carrying the weight of that drawer's contents for 2 years by not opening it, and that the weight had not diminished by being carried. Then he looked at Margaret. She was standing by the dowager's chair, her hands at her sides, in the blue-grey dress, and she was looking back at him. This was the whole of it. This was the accountable sum of 6 months in a fading house on the edge of the moor. The bread and the lantern, and the walled garden, and the letter in the column, and the soprano's voice, and the drawer he hadn't opened, and the crack across his chest in the dark outside the cottage door. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the chandelier sent its 40 candles across both of them, steady and unhidden. He said, "Miss Felbridge." His voice carried clearly in the still room. "Margaret." The second name came differently. Not performed, not announced, simply used. The way you use the name of someone you have meant for a long time to address by it. "You came to this house in December, with a lantern and a canvas bag and a promise you intended to keep. And you kept it. You saved your brother with what you had, which was considerably less than the task required, and you gave him back to himself. A pause. Not for effect, he was not a man who used pauses for effect, but because the next thing needed arriving at rather than proceeding to. I have been too proud, and too accustomed to being too proud, to offer what I have as freely as you gave what you had. That ends tonight. He said, I will be proud to stand beside you. I would be honoured to call you my Duchess, if you will have a man who required 6 months of your instruction to arrive at the obvious. The room was still. Lady Wilhelmina's silver thimble turned once in her closed hand. The private rhythm of a woman who has waited for this with the patience of someone who knew it was coming and understood that the only variable was when. Margaret said, I will. 2 words, plainly spoken, in the register she used for things that were entirely certain. The room exhaled. The wedding was in September, at the church on the Westridge Road, and the reception was in the great room with the chandelier burning and the fiddlers from Harrogate and all 40 candles, and Mrs. Grimes cried in the passage outside the kitchen where no one was likely to see her, and Henderson did not cry, and nodded once at the wall with the settled expression of a man whose conclusion has been confirmed. Jenny made the pastry for the wedding breakfast, and it was, objectively, exceptional. And Dr. Hawkins ate 3 pieces of it, and said so in the dry tone of a man making a formal assessment. Tom did not dance at the wedding. He had not promised himself he would, only that he would be there, and he was. He stood at the edge of the churchyard afterward, with Will beside him, the Merlin-handled crutch under his arm, and watched his sister come out of the church in September light. That evening, when the reception had settled into its later hours and the guests were comfortable and well fed and the fiddles were playing a reel that Jenny was dancing to with a young footman, Margaret slipped out through the side door of the great house and walked north across the park. The moon was up. She did not need the lantern for the path. She knew every step of it by now, the soft ground at the ditch, the right side of the plank bridge, the gap in the larches where the track opened. She carried it anyway, the brass-fitted horn lantern, old but sound, its wick new and its light steady. Tom's cottage window was lit. Through the glass, the good, clear glass, the pane the Duke had paid for in January, and that now threw a clean rectangle of warmth onto the frost-pale grass, she could see Tom at the table, his leg out straight, his hands moving. He was carving. Not the crutch this time. Something smaller, something he had been working on for weeks. Dr. Hawkins was opposite him, with his book of Roman campaigns open on the table between them, talking with the animated quality he reserved for the engineering chapters. Tom was laughing at something the doctor had just said, the full, unguarded laugh that was his and had come back to him. Margaret paused at the edge of the path. She lifted the lantern. From the great house behind her, a second light appeared in the library window. Warm, steady. The Duke at his desk, with the drawer open at last. The letters laid out. His brother's handwriting visible in the lamplight. And his face, if she could have seen it from that distance, doing something it had not done in 2 years. She held her lantern up a moment longer. The 2 lights shone across the dark park, neither hiding, and the night was very quiet, and the cottage window held its warm, clear light, and Tom was laughing.